Hello, this is Michael Beers, a social media editor for Jam Magazine, and I'm here with Andy West, phenomenal bass player of the DIXIE DREGS. Andy, thank you for making this appearance.
Thank you, Mike, for coming over and talking.
Great. Well, hey, let's start off. Wow, 40 years for a Dregs reunion. How did this come about for you to get the original nucleus of the DIXIE DREGS and put together this tour?
Yeah, so the 40-year thing is this particular, I almost want to say conflagration instead of configuration, but it's this particular group of guys, right? This is the same band that did the Freefall album, and last year, 2017, was the 40th anniversary of that release of that album. So basically, I guess it's mostly mine and the drummer Rod Morgenstein and the manager Frank Solomon's fault for even suggesting this. And but that's really what happened. We just kind of started an email chain. Hey, what about, wouldn't it be fun if people could see this? And there's this kind of a poignant timing to it and all that. And one thing led to another. Steve suggested we come down to his place and jam and see how it sounded, and it felt pretty darn good. So we said, why not? And then it turned into this.
Great. Now, on this tour, approximately how many cities, how long is this tour going to be, and about how many dates are you guys doing?
Yeah, it's over 2 legs, and it's spread over 2 months, but it's about 35 cities, I think.
Great, great. What do you enjoy most when you're on tour?
Well, that's going to, I don't know, because I haven't been on tour for a long time. But I think that the main thing is, you're in a little bubble, and there's again, with people that all of us in this particular group have, even though our history is not necessarily together, isn't necessarily recent, it feels very current. So I think the main thing is just the hang with the guys, and the performance aspects of it are to be discovered, but I anticipate a lot of really cool kind of just feelings between the band and the crowd. So
great. Let's go back to the past. How old were you when you began to play bass, and was that your first instrument that you did begin to play, and what was your first bass guitar that you began playing with?
Yeah, so I actually started on guitar, and but after about a year of having a guitar, I won't say I was learning how to play it, just kind of banging around on it. I can't remember the exact motivation for transitioning to bass, but it seemed like, maybe I broke some strings, or we felt like we needed a bass player or something in the little group we had hanging out. And so then I transitioned to a bass, and the first bass I had was a Univox Beetle bass copy, and it was really cool. It sounded great, and I've seen them on eBay now. They're still, I guess, they're kind of weirdly collectible, but that's how that happened.
And when you were playing bass while growing up, what bass players did you listen to, or did you want to emulate, to capture the kind of sound that they had?
Yeah, well, the first bass player I became aware of was Paul McCartney as a bassist, just kind of like, and so listening to those Beatles songs and trying to pick them out on bass was really interesting. Then as I got more into really being a musician, the kind of mind-blowing bassists that sort of appeared, like Jack Bruce, Jack Cassidy, John Entwistle, all those kinds of, Chris Squire, every one of them, it seemed, was kind of changing the way people conceived and heard bass.
And now you grew up in Atlanta, or the Atlanta area?
Yeah.
And growing up, what was some of the best concerts you ever saw?
Oh God, so many. I think the first concert I ever saw was Jimi Hendrix. And I saw Hendrix a couple times when I was a teenager, and I saw Cream play in Atlanta at a place called Chastain Park. And in 1969 and 1970 were the Atlanta pop festivals, the 2 pop festivals. So those were just kind of life-changing from a musical perspective. You could go online and find out all the bands that played there, but it was just, it was the first Atlanta Pop Festival occurred before Woodstock, for example. So, that was the era.
Right. Could you share the story of how you met Steve Morris in school?
Well, sure. So I I actually didn't grow up in Atlanta. I mean, growing up is a weird kind of notion because I think until you're about 10, you don't really have a sense of place so much. You know, you just sort of know the people around you and how they talk and act and stuff. But when I was 12, we moved to Atlanta from near Cleveland, Ohio, and I do remember, and that was the mid-'60s, and I do remember, based on my impression of what I saw on television at the time, I thought that Atlanta must be like a crazy place with people rioting and all kinds of stuff, you know, and talking funny, which they did talk funny, but there wasn't a lot of rioting going on. So I moved there, and then, you know, when I was on the eve of I was 16, but I was just about to turn 17. My dad got a job in Augusta, and so on January 1970, we moved to Augusta, and I went into high school there, and that's where I met Steve. I had previously had a friend of mine tell me about a young hotshot guitar player who he heard when they were playing in Augusta, like, you know, months before. Said, yeah, there's a kid there who plays just like Jimmy Page, you know, he's really great. And he said, his name's Steve Morse, and I remembered his name, and it turned out that we were in the same class together in high school, so we just became friends and went from there.
And how long after you and Steve, so you met Steve in school, did you say, well, hey, I play bass, you play guitar, you want to try jamming? I mean,
yeah, pretty much. I mean, well, I told him that I had heard about him from my friends, and he said, well, yeah, I got a band, why don't you come by and listen to his practice or something? And so I went over there and heard him play, and I was like, man, can we try and jam or play or something? And so we just started hanging out and playing.
So after you started hanging out and playing, how long between that point and when the DIXIE Dregs were formed?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I moved there in January 1970. There was a reference to Dixie Grit, which was the precursor to the Dregs, and that was in 1972. And then the first reference I've been able to find to the Dixie Dregs was in early 1973. So, you know, between like June of 72 and maybe June of 73, something happened, and it became the Dregs.
And so when you guys started off as the DIXIE Dregs, were you doing primarily cover tunes, or did you have original material?
No, we really wanted to do original tunes, so Dixie Grit was the precursor, and that was a 5-piece band, and we were writing songs and experimenting and stuff, but as that band kind of broke up, we really went more into the experimental stuff, and Steve started writing a lot of things, and I mean, we naturally played songs that we knew, but there was a lot of experimentation, and kind of that's where Steve started to really learn to write, I think.
And to the best of your knowledge, what was the first DIXIE Dregs tune that you guys recorded, or you know, that you wrote together?
Well, first off, we didn't really write stuff. In the very early days, we were jamming, so licks would pop out, but what happened was Steve started to really get a compositional sense, so he would start to come in with song ideas that were much more formed. So I don't really know, you know, honestly. I mean, there's some licks that I remember that we played that made it into Dregs songs, but Steve, you know, really made more cogent forms out of those things. So.
Can you tell us how the DIXIE Dregs hooked up with road icon Twiggs Linden?
Yeah. So, you know, we lived in Augusta. Macon was down the road, basically, and but we, even though we had this crazy name, we didn't consider ourselves Southern rock band, you know, at all. And but we were still playing all over the South because that's where we lived, and we had to operate as a base out of there, and so we were playing all around. And as I remember, and I think it's a shared sort of story, Twiggs and Chuck LaBelle they just happened to be in Nashville at the same time we were playing the Exit In, and kind of came in and heard us play and really loved the band. And you know, Chuck at that time was either he had been playing with he had been with the Allman Brothers. I don't know if they were still that active at that moment, but he had, you know, Sea Level, and Twiggs. You know, one day I seem to remember him just coming up to see us, and I think it was a place called Rose's Cantina in Atlanta. I'll have to double check that. It's making me wonder now. But I remember he came to a gig and said, "Okay, I want to work for you guys." And we said, "Well, wow, that's great, but we don't have any money. You know, he said, that'll come. Don't worry about it. I'll show you guys what you need to know, and I think you're going to be great, and I'd really like to work for you. And so that was, he came up to us and offered.
Great. And could you share your favorite Twiggs Linden story? Something that would stand out. I mean, to show, to see, kind of encapsulate what Twiggs Linden was all about.
Well, we have a song called Twiggs Approved, which is named after Twiggs. And the whole thing with Twiggs was, he had been around the world with the Allmans, so he knew firsthand what all of the rigors of touring and all of the things that can go wrong and all the stuff that can go haywire. And he basically took it upon himself to educate us in every area and corner of the world in that regard. And so there's so many things, but it was mainly about just teaching us what works and what doesn't. That gear is going to fall apart. You can't load that in a truck. You can't have, you have to have redundant systems, all this type of stuff. And so he was like he was a road manager for us, but he was also a mentor. And so, I have nothing but great memories of all that stuff. And there's some stories about him, like he helped me build. I asked him, I said, I had all these effects that I wanted to use, but I had a particular way I wanted to do this stuff. And so he sat down with me, and we kind of worked out this whole plan to build this case that would have everything in it exactly the way I wanted it. It was switching, it would be able to, all this stuff is very common now, but back then it was, really like advanced. And we worked on that thing. I remember he was down in the basement of my house soldering a 50-channel snake together so that I'd have one cable that would go from this box to my pedal board, and he was just amazing in that way.
So it was through Twiggs that the DIXIE Dregs signed with Capricorn?
Well, a combination of Twiggs and Chuck.
Okay.
Because Chuck, I think, went to Phil and said, hey, I heard this band.
That's Phil Walden.
Yeah, Phil Walden said, I heard this band and you got to hear these guys. And, we got a gig in Macon expressly so that we could get Phil to come over and listen to us.
So so you had an album, you recorded Free Fall, you got an album under your belt. Then you guys had to take your album on the road. Now, did Twiggs help you build? Didn't you have like a truck converted into a tour bus?
Yeah. So Twiggs had he actually made the truck, and he had a truck that he had built. It was it may have been a 22-foot truck, and he took the first 8 feet of it and built a cabin into it with 6 bunks in it. And we basically would climb in through the front of the cab. He had like a hole cut where the rear window was into the thing, and we would slide through this hole into the truck, and that's where we all traveled and basically lived from that point forward.
And didn't you guys christen that truck? Did it have a special name?
Yeah, it was called Black Hearted Woman.
Okay, nice. So when you guys were in your earlier stages, what was the strangest billing that you could recall where the DIXIE Dregs were teamed up to open up or have somebody open up for you? Like for instance, like Ma Vision Orchestra, one time they had to open up for Cheech and Chong. Did you ever experience anything like that?
Well, okay, so we had some really weird gigs, but they weren't necessarily opening act gigs. We played a gig at VMI once, Virginia Military Institute, which was the parents' weekend. And I remember we walked into this place, and they had all these tables set up with checkered tablecloths. It was like a big, dining hall. And we were supposed to be playing while the parents and the kids were in there eating. And it would just made no sense whatsoever. And we hit the first couple of notes, and everyone just fell out of their chairs, and they basically told us to stop. So there was that. I think, we played, someday I'm going to write down a list of all the shows we opened for, but we always had a way of kind of winning over the audience. not even knowing any more than I did at the time, we opened up for Muddy Waters in Boston, which is just a really weird combination, but it was so cool, and the crowd was into it. They gave us a pass,
Nice.
Yeah.
So you got your first album, then you're going to start to work on your second album, and that's when the Dixie Dregs hooked up with icon producer engineer Ken Scott as your producer. How did you hook up with Ken Scott?
Well, okay, so we were big fans of Mob Vision Orchestra, obviously, and we wanted Ken to produce our first album, and we told Capricorn that we wanted that, and they said, well, he's not available, but we have this other guy. That's a whole other story, but from the very beginning, it was like, wouldn't it be great if we could get Ken Scott, who produced Mob Vishnu, whose albums sound incredible, and we kept trying, and we got him for the next 2 albums.
Great. And so after you guys recorded What If, you took the first time, I believe, the Dixie Dregs went to the West Coast, and there's like a historic moment for you guys when you played at the Roxy. You had a bunch of high-level VIPs in the front row watching you. Could you first of all name some of those VIPs that were checking out the Dixie Dregs, and what did it feel to be playing before these icons or heroes of yours?
Yeah, well, there were a lot of people there. The ones that I think Billy Cobham's band was in town, and I know Stanley Clark was there, and I don't think McLaughlin showed up at that one, but there were just a lot of the kind of fusion guys at the time. So you probably know more than I do who was there. But
well, I heard Jeff Beck was there too.
Well, I don't know. I don't
Okay.
recall that.
Okay.
But it was pretty intense. I mean, LA was always a really interesting place to play, and the Roxy was always fun because it was small and it sounded great in there.
So after the Dixie Dregs became just the Dregs, you had the album Industry Standard, and that's when you had Eddie Offord as your producer. What was it like working with Eddie Offord?
Yeah, so Eddie was great. I mean, for some reason, who knows why, he decided to move to Atlanta, and he bought an old movie theater and opened it up as a recording studio, and his whole thing was, I'm just going to record bands like they're live in here. They're going to get up on the stage, and it's a big room. It's not like a controlled, acoustically designed environment. We're just going to play live. And so that was kind of his whole philosophy and theory, and Eddie was great. He was just, a really interesting guy.